Thousands of women marched on our nation's capital the day after the inauguration to stress their concern about many issues in the years ahead. Berkshire Eagle reporter and former Connecting Point host Carrie Saldo covered the event. Carrie sat down with me to tell us about the event and the women she traveled with.
I was on a bus that had about 55 people, one of 6 buses heading down from the Berkshires, and then, of course, tons of other people going in cars and sort of organizing in their own way. But in talking with the group of people on my bus, it ranged. The youngest person on my bus was 12 years old. The oldest 2 people were in their 70s. And so the young women who I spoke with were there because they were really curious about the nature of protests. They're 12 to 15 years old. They're learning about the civil rights movement right now in school. And so they went down with their organizers, and on the bus and leading up to getting into DC, we're really talking about, civil rights and what they had learned. One of the young women, Kia Robinson, who's 12, asked Shirley Edgerton, who's the woman who runs an organization called ROPE, which works on sort of youth empowerment issues, and it's a youth empowerment program for these young women. Kia asked Shirley, as we were coming up out of the metro station, what's tear gas? And so she clearly had been listening to the news and had seen the protests the night before and some of the violence connected to that. And so Shirley sort of very calmly explained to her, it's a way that sometimes crowds are controlled, and but that won't be something we encounter here, or if we do, we're not going to engage in a violent way. We're going to meet violence with nonviolence if that becomes an issue, and it wasn't. The nature of the march on Saturday was incredibly peaceful.
What was it like in D.C.? You mentioned the one young girl saying, what about tear gas if we encounter that? But on the ground in D.C., clearly crowds were significant. I'm reluctant to use the word huge, but they were. It was an amazing event. And you said just keeping together at times was difficult.
It went from very crowded when we got into DC probably around 11:30, maybe 12 o'clock, and the rally was expected to end at 1, and then the march was supposed to start shortly thereafter. And so, as I said, it was crowded when we got there. The rally went about 2 hours late because, as the national news reported, there were a lot of surprise guests and speakers ran long. So the march itself didn't start until about 2 hours later, but the crowd was getting really excited. You could tell people were sort of starting to march when we got there at noon. So we initially thought when we got there, maybe the march started early. But no, that just turned out what it was people were excited and anxious and started marching along the parade route before the rally had even ended. But then when the rally ended, to answer your question, it went from very crowded to extremely dense.
It was life-changing, one woman said. Talk about that.
Yeah, it was life-changing. It was what one of the women I overheard them saying, one of the young women I overheard them saying. And I just thought that was such a beautiful sentiment to come from such a young person, to have had that experience at such a young age, that then she can take that and move forward.
Talking to these people there, and on the bus ride back, and everybody's pretty tired, but still, there's the whole reaction kind of bubbling up. And what happens now? Because a lot of observers have said, well, it's fine. And it puts the White House on some notice that people are watching. And we know in the past, protests have made a difference in our nation's political life. But what about these folks? Do you have a sense that they've come together in some way to try and influence, to try and keep the strength they had as hundreds of thousands of people marching on the Capitol?
Well, I think that with the Women's March in particular, as we talked about a few minutes ago, the reasons that people were marching really ranged. There was a wide array of issues, whether it was they're there to protest the fact that Donald Trump was elected, whether it's abortion rights, whether it's immigrant rights, lots of different issues. So you've got this broad movement with tons of issues, and it becomes difficult to maybe find direction. And I think that the national organizers and also the local chapter heads are very aware of that. If you look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, or if you look at the Tea Party even, movements, the Black Lives Matter movement that have come up recently, a lot of momentum, a lot of passion, but maybe not a strong action plan. And it seems to me that organizers of the Women's March are very sensitive to that. National leaders, according to the New York Times, met within hours of the march ending to discuss what's next. And they've actually rolled out an action plan on their website where they're taking 10 actions in 100 days. The first of which is a letter writing campaign. They're encouraging people to download a postcard and go ahead and let their legislators know what they think. And I know that people from the Berkshires are definitely already organizing. People are saying, come to my house, we're gonna pick a date, and we're gonna get a whole group of people together and write those letters. I know that there's one couple who's writing a children's book to talk about the nature of dissent and protest so that people who are interested in this can speak with their children about it.
I got to draw you out of the march a little bit, but very much related to it. As a journalist, I want to get your thoughts and feelings on this. At about the same time the march is winding down on Saturday, the new White House press secretary, Sean Spicer, calls reporters to the briefing room. That's unusual in itself, late on a Saturday afternoon. So there's a little tension. And he basically reads a statement, takes no question, dresses reporters down and says, why are you going after us on the questions about the crowd for the inauguration? There are pictures very clearly showing a bigger crowd for Barack Obama's 2009 event than Donald Trump's, but still, there it is. Why are you saying we had a smaller crowd? There are all kinds of different mitigating facts. It's the ground cover that makes it look different, so forth and so on. You're going to hold us accountable. We're going to hold you accountable. My reaction was, hey, that's our deal. That's our job as journalists. You went down and covered this event. There's some anger about this event happening in the new administration. What's your sense of where we're at?
To me, it seems like people are ready to express their frustration. And I think that that's what the Women's March was all about. You know, national organizers were very clear that this was not meant to be an anti-Trump rally. However, when you talk with, the people from the Berkshires who I spoke with, some were very clear that they were incredibly unhappy that Donald Trump was elected president. And I think that people want to organize around that. Now, that's also not to say that there were many people who did obviously vote for Donald Trump. And so I think that we're going to hear from people who did support Trump in some way as we continue to move forward, just as we'll continue to hear from those people who are connected to the Women's March. And I think it's going to be a really vocal time for this country, regardless of your opinion of whether you support the Women's March or whether you are a Donald Trump supporter. It seems to me that people want their voices to be heard.
Carrie Saldo, reporter for the Berkshire Eagle, one of this country's great papers. Thanks for coming in. Pleasure to have you and pleasure to see you.
Wonderful to be back. Thanks for having me.